I'm Peter Burlingame of the Self-Defense Initiative. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the basics of marksmanship, what it takes to put a bullet into a target. The whole purpose of shooting is to place a bullet into a desired target. To put a bullet into the target, two things must happen. The gun must be in line with the target, and then it must discharge. If the gun is indeed in line with the target at the moment of discharge, the bullet will hit the target. There's a number of different ways of lining up the gun with the target, a number of different ways of aiming the gun at the target. One way of aiming the pistol is to use the sights. It is the most precise and consistent way of lining up the pistol with the target. The typical rear sight on a pistol looks like this. It's basically a U-shaped notch. Think of it as a window that you look through. The front sight is typically a post that looks very similar to this. So to line up the sights, we look through the rear sight and we find the front sight. Now the first reference will be that we want the front sight centered in the rear sight notch. So you want to see the same amount of light on either side of the front sight. The second reference is that we want the tops of the sights to be even with each other. So equal amounts of light on either side of the front sight show us that it is centered in the notch, and the top edges of the sights being in line with each other is the other reference point. These sights are now in line with your eye. So your eye, the rear sight, the front sight are all in line with each other. This is called sight alignment. The next step is to take this sight alignment and apply it to a target. So we have a typical target. Let's say we wanted to put a bullet into this area where the 0 is. We have the sights lined up. We have an equal amount of light on either side of the front sight showing us that it is centered. The top edges of the sights are even. The sights are lined up with your eye. Now we need to incorporate the target as part of this equation. We want to put the top of the front sight on what we want to hit. So if we were trying to hit this 0, we'd put the top of the front sight on the 0. Now, not only do we have sight alignment, we have sight picture. So we bring the gun up on target, look through the rear sight, find the front sight. We want equal amounts of light on either side of the front sight. We want the top edge of the sights even with each other. We put the top edge of the front sight on what we want to hit. So you can see the top edge of the front sight is in the center of that circle. Notice that we can't hold the pistol perfectly steady. Sight alignment is a continual process. Shooting is a parallel activity. So while we're lining up the sights, we're going to start slowly pressing the trigger. We're going to make little corrections to the sight alignment while we're pressing on the trigger. Eventually, we'll have enough pressure on the trigger to make the gun fire. And because we've been watching the sight alignment the entire time, we'll have a hit. Bring the gun up on target, look through the rear sight, find the front sight, line them up, slowly increase the pressure while you're watching the sights. Make the little corrections as necessary. Line up the sights. Slowly increase the pressure. Continue to work the sight alignment while you're pressing the trigger. Remember, this is a parallel activity. We've talked about sight alignment and sight picture. How to line up your eye, the rear sight, the front sight, and the target to get consistent, accurate hits. The next part of the equation is the trigger pull. There's a couple things we need to talk about in regards to trigger pull. One of those is trigger placement. What part of your finger should touch what part of the trigger, and how we go about pulling the trigger. We pull the trigger with our index finger. And the first thing we need to talk about is the placement of your finger on the trigger. and what part of your finger should touch what part of the trigger. Generally, you want the center of the pad of the first joint of the finger to touch the trigger. That is the only part of your finger that should make contact with the trigger, and indeed the gun. So think about placing that line on the front face of the trigger. That is the only place your trigger finger should touch the pistol. You may notice that there's a gap between my trigger finger and the frame of the pistol. The only place the trigger finger should touch the pistol is the face of the trigger. While you're pressing the trigger, you may apply pressure to the frame of the pistol, which pushes the pistol off of alignment with the target. What we're going to want to do is press straight back, straight along the axis of the pistol. That's the only place we want to put pressure, is straight on the face of the trigger. Take that line and place it on the center of the face of the trigger. Then we can wrap our hand around the pistol. Once we have our finger properly placed on the trigger, the next thing we need to think about is how we press the trigger. I mentioned that we want to press the trigger straight back, applying pressure along the axis of the pistol. How much pressure should we put on the trigger? Just enough to make it fire, no more, no less. How do we know how much that is? Well, we don't really. What we're going to do is place 1 ounce at a time on the trigger until we finally get to that last ounce and the gun fires. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we say the sights are lined up with the target, it's time to make the gun fire, and we just mash on the trigger, you will disturb that sight alignment that you've been working so hard on. Let's say we apply 7 pounds of pressure all of a sudden to this trigger. Once the trigger is released, that 7 pounds of pressure will be transferred to the frame of the pistol. And because of the geometry of the pistol being in an L shape, that pressure will make the front of the gun dip down, which will result in your shots going low. The other problem with just making the gun go off is that you can anticipate the recoil then. You'll know the exact moment the gun's firing, and you know that it's going to recoil against you, and the natural tendency is to push against that recoil. And you'll develop a flinch, and it'll look like this. So once again, we want to put the center of the first pad of the finger on the center of the face of the trigger. Slowly apply pressure straight back along the axis of the pistol, slowly increasing the pressure 1 ounce at a time until finally we achieve enough to get the gun to fire. We know 2 things have to happen for a bullet to enter the target. 1, the gun must be aligned with the target, and 2, it must discharge while it's still aligned with the target. And what we need to think about is that these are not serial activities, they are parallel activities. It's not that we get the sights lined up with the target and now we can check off box A, we've accomplished that task, and we can now move on to task B, pulling the trigger. If you do it serially, task A and then task B, you will end up having missing problems. But we need to think of these not as serial activities where we do one activity and that's accomplished so we can check it off and then we can move on to the second activity. So we don't line up the sights, okay, that's done, and then move on to pulling the trigger. But instead, these are parallel activities. So while we're lining up the sights with the target, we are also pressing the trigger. Lining up the sights, pressing the trigger. These are happening simultaneously. You're making micro corrections in the sight alignment to keep them as close to on line with the target as possible, while you're slowly increasing the pressure on the trigger straight back along the axis of the pistol. And because you're doing them simultaneously, at the point where you've achieved enough trigger pressure to get the gun to fire, the sights are on target.